Welcome to your deep dive.
Today we're tackling...
Shashi Tharoor's An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India.
Okay.
This book is,
It's not a light read by any means, but wow, does it pack a punch.
It does.
You sent us a whole stack of excerpts, the table of contents.
Yeah.
Even some of the opening pages.
Clearly, you're ready to get into the nitty-gritty of British colonialism's impact on India.
Yeah, I think that this book really does a good job of taking all of these different pieces, historical analysis, economic data, even some literary criticism, and weaving them together to make a really compelling case. It's not just a dry recounting of facts, but it really pulls you in.
Okay, so let's unpack this then.
So, one of the central arguments that we see throughout is about reparations.
Right.
Thoreau proposes that Britain owe India for centuries of exploitation. He even suggests a symbolic £1 per year for 200 years.
Yeah, and that's actually something that caused quite a bit of controversy, even within India itself. There are those who feel that dwelling on these past injustices hinders progress,
Right.
And then there are others who feel that it's absolutely vital to acknowledge the wrongs of the past in order to heal and move forward.
Yeah. No, I can definitely see both sides of that.
Yeah.
But first, I think it's wild this whole book came out of a single speech.
I know, right?
Yeah.
That's how it all began.
Yeah.
Tharoor gave a talk at the Oxford Union back in 2015.
Oh, wow.
Arguing for reparations.
Yeah.
And it just blew up. It went viral. And that really seemed to push him to flesh it all out in An Era of Darkness.
So speaking of An Era of Darkness, one of the most compelling parts, for me at least, was how Tharoor describes the systematic looting of India.
Right.
It's not just individual acts of greed.
But like how the entire British system was set up to benefit at India's expense.
It really was. And he uses the example of the Indian textile industry as kind of a prime example of this.
Ah, okay.
Before the British arrived, India was this global textile powerhouse.
Right. Beautiful fabrics. Everybody wanted them.
Beautiful fabrics, yeah. Exported everywhere.
Yep.
And then the British, they wanted in on that action.
Well, yeah, of course.
So what they did...
They wanted a monopoly.
They did. They crippled the Indian industry by taking Indian cotton.
Okay.
Using it as raw material for their own factories in Britain.
Right.
And then they turned around and sold the finished products back to India at inflated prices.
It's like the textbook case of exploitation.
Absolutely. But Tharoor doesn't stop there.
Oh.
He goes on to detail how the East India Company and later the British government itself, they extracted huge sums of money from India through taxation.
Like, how high are we talking?
Often set at rates exceeding 50%.
Are you serious? 50%? That's insane.
It's mind-boggling. And all that revenue just went straight to London, enriching Britain while draining India dry.
Wow.
And he gives these really stark examples like Robert Clive's infamous plunder.
Right.
Which really illustrates the corruption that was just woven into the entire system. But it's not just about these grand acts of theft. It's also about the everyday impact that these policies had on Indian peasants who were forced to pay these exorbitant taxes even during times of famine.
Which, speaking of famine, that's another really, really dark chapter that Tharoor dives into. He argues that millions died needlessly because of British policies. Especially their insistence on sticking to this laissez-faire economics.
Right. They just clung to this idea of free markets, even in the face of widespread starvation.
I mean, how do you justify that?
It's hard to fathom.
Yeah.
They prioritized these economic principles over actually providing humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
I mean, they even went so far as to export grain from India during times of famine.
Oh my gosh. That's just evil.
It's horrific. It really highlights the human cost of this whole idea of empire.
It really does. And it's not just the economic policies. Tharoor also dismantles this notion that Britain brought political unity to India.
Yeah, he calls that a fabrication.
He says India had experienced periods of unity before the British even showed up.
Right. He argues that, if anything, the British actually made things worse by exacerbating those societal divisions, especially along religious lines, to maintain control.
It's like that whole divide and conquer strategy.
Exactly. And he argues that this strategy ultimately culminated in the horrors of partition in 1947.
Man, that's heavy stuff.
It is. And he doesn't just make these claims, he backs them up by showing how the census was used to solidify these caste and religious identities, how they introduced separate electorates to sow discord.
So it's like it's almost like they were intentionally trying to pit people against each other.
Exactly. It paints a very different picture than this often romanticized view of the British coming in and unifying a fragmented India.
Okay, so we've got economic exploitation, we've got manufactured famines, political manipulation, but it doesn't stop there, does it?
Right.
Tharoor also tackles the spectacle of British power, especially under Lord Curzon.
Right. Think lavish imperial durbars, all designed to project this image of British superiority and grandeur.
It's like they were trying to compensate for something.
Maybe so. But while they were busy with these grand displays, the reality for millions of Indians was a daily struggle for survival.
It's such a stark contrast.
It is.
Right.
And Tharoor highlights that contrast really, really effectively.
And then there's the whole issue of the Indian civil service.
Yeah.
Like, on paper, it allowed Indians to rise in the ranks, but
The reality was much more complicated.
yeah.
Tharoor really digs into the...
It wasn't always cracked up to be.
Not at all. He talks about how, despite their qualifications, Indians face these incredible obstacles to advancement.
Like an unspoken ceiling.
Exactly. And he points to specific examples, instances of blatant racism, and how even figures like Lord Macaulay, who you might think of as being progressive for his time,
Right.
even he promoted a system that was really designed to create this anglicized Indian elite that was still ultimately subservient to the British.
Just like giving with one hand and taking away with the other.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established that British rule wasn't exactly all sunshine and roses. But they did introduce things like a free press and a parliamentary system, right?
Right.
Weren't those steps towards democracy, even if they were flawed?
That's where it gets really interesting. Tharoor acknowledges that these institutions were introduced,
Yeah.
but he argues that they were primarily tools for control,
Oh, interesting.
not genuine steps towards Indian self-governance.
So it's like it looks good on the surface, but underneath.
Exactly. He talks about how the press was still subject to censorship.
Of course.
And he points to these draconian laws, like the Rowlatt Act,
What was that one again?
which allowed for imprisonment without trial,
Oh, wow.
and Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code,
Okay.
which, believe it or not, criminalized homosexuality.
Oh.
And these laws were often used to silence dissent, to target anyone who dared to challenge British authority.
In the name of keeping order, right?
Exactly. It's this stark reminder that even the things that we often associate with democracy, these institutions, they can be manipulated. They can be twisted to serve very different purposes.
Yeah, that's a good point. And speaking of manipulation, Tharoor also talks about this really tragic chapter, the forced migration of millions of Indians as indentured laborers to other parts of the British Empire.
It's heartbreaking. He sheds light on this lesser-known aspect of British colonialism.
Where were they sent?
These laborers were sent all over, Mauritius, Fiji, the Caribbean,
Wow.
to work in brutal conditions. And he really drives home the point that this diaspora had a lasting impact.
Yeah.
It's a story that continues to this day.
Right. Those connections are still there. So we're seeing this pattern here, right? It's not just about isolated incidents. It's all part of this larger system designed to extract wealth and maintain control.
Exactly. And Thoreau does this masterful job of connecting all these dots for the reader.
And then in his final chapter, The Imbalance Sheet, he tries to weigh the pros and cons of British rule. I'm guessing the scales don't tip in favor of the British.
You guess right. He argues that any supposed benefits, they pale in comparison to the overwhelming evidence of exploitation and oppression. He concludes that the British, ultimately, they were foreigners in India.
Right.
And their so-called civilizing mission, it was really just a thinly veiled attempt to advance their own interests.
It's all just self-serving.
Exactly.
And their legacy is ultimately one of just, I don't know, extraction and suffering.
Yeah, exactly. And in the epilogue, The Messy Afterlife of Colonialism, he kind of explores how that legacy continues to impact the present. Like, he talks about this thing called imperial amnesia.
Imperial amnesia. What's that?
Yeah, it's like this collective forgetting, right? Britain's reluctance to fully acknowledge the brutality of its colonial past.
Oh, okay. So it's like sweeping it under the rug, pretending it never happened, or at least downplaying it.
Exactly. And Tharoor's point is that this isn't just about the past. It's dangerous because without acknowledging and confronting these injustices, then true reconciliation and healing, those become impossible.
That makes sense.
And he also brings up this idea of the jewel in the crown narrative, this kind of romanticized idea of the British Empire that just totally ignores the very real cost at which it was built.
Yeah, it's a very selective memory, isn't it? Choosing
Yeah.
to remember the glory without acknowledging the exploitation.
Yeah, exactly. And, even today, we see this with, like, you send those excerpts about those British politicians who were talking about reviving the empire.
Oh, right. Like it was this great thing that should make a comeback.
Yeah, and it's like, guys, you can't just cherry pick the parts you like.
Yeah, it's all connected.
And that's really what Thoreau is challenging us to do. He wants us to look beyond this polished facade of empire and confront these really uncomfortable truths that are underneath.
And it's not just about economics and politics, right?
No, not at all.
I mean, those excerpts you send about education reform, Thoreau really gets into the whole cultural impact of British rule, too.
Oh, absolutely. Because it wasn't just about, taxes and cranes. It was also about reshaping India's cultural fabric. So promoting Western ideas, Western education, and simultaneously undermining these traditional Indian knowledge systems.
So it's kind of like what we were saying earlier about the economy. They wanted to control the narrative just on a cultural level this time.
Exactly. And what Thoreau argues is that this created this system where even today, many Indians are still grappling with the effects of this colonial mindset, right?
Yeah, it's like even though the British physically left, they left behind this whole framework that continues to affect how Indians view themselves and their place in the world.
That's a really good way to put it. And that's actually what makes this book so relevant, because he's not just talking about some events that happened way back when, he's connecting them to the present day, showing how intertwined they really are.
Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here, like from economic exploitations to political manipulations to cultural undermining. If you had to pick, what's like the one big thing you hope someone takes away from an era of darkness?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's a wake-up call. Like, Thoreau wants us to confront the realities of colonialism, not just in India, but globally.
Right.
He's asking us to think critically about the narratives that we've been taught, to consider the perspectives of those who've been historically marginalized, whose stories haven't been told.
It's about understanding that history isn't really just in the past. It continues to shape the world that we live in today.
Exactly. And, maybe, just maybe, by understanding these legacies of colonialism, we can start to dismantle these systems of inequality that are still very much present today.
Wow. That's a powerful thought to end on. This whole deep dive has given me so much to think about, honestly.
It's a lot to unpack.
And I feel like we've just scratched the surface. There's this whole world of post-colonial literature and scholarship out there exploring these exact ideas.
It's a whole field of study.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So much more to learn. Well, that's all the time we have for today. But until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.